The space race is over, and I'll never get to the moon. By Schistosity. Read by My Lost and Found. Chapter 3. Voyager. When Lance was 7, his parents took him to watch a rocket launch at Cape Canaveral. It was out of their way, a couple 100 miles north from where they were visiting family in Miami. His dad had been against such a detour, but Lance had begged hard enough that on the 3rd day of their trip, his mom and dad had packed up the minivan and they had driven up the hot Atlantic coast to the Cape. The rocket was not a manned one. The Mars projects were old news, and the Artemis program, which sent the first manned craft to Titan, had begun to decline long before Lance was old enough to really care about space. The only launches they were making now were supply ships or unmanned probes. But those launches were enough to boil Lance's blood in anticipation for what they were leading to. The Kerberos program, the next step in deep space exploration. The farthest manned spaceflight in history was coming. Lance remembered the feeling of watching the rocket, a simple supply ship, launch skyward with a force and sound unlike anything he had ever seen. He stared in awe as the force of its blatant disregard for gravity shook the very ground beneath them, as if to say, "I will not be held down." He remembered how it felt to watch it recede into the clouds from his perch on his father's shoulders. In that moment, for just a second, he felt a sadness that he was down here and not up there. After that day, Lance decided to change that. He had spent the next few days immersed in everything space-related, having almost picked the Cape Canaveral brochure rack clean on his way home. He spent hours poring over pamphlets on the history of the Space Center and the space program, staring at the pictures of the Apollo crews until his eyes hurt. He read everything from the visitor's guide map to a small pamphlet about guest lectures in the month of August. Everything was fascinating. When he got home, he ran to his grandmother's arms on her seat on the porch. He babbled at her until the sun went down about the stars and how he was going to see them one day. He remembered what she said later, over drinks with his parents, something he didn't understand at the time. "Every generation has their space age," she said, ruffling his hair. "And theirs is going to be magnificent." Lance was 16 when the Kerberos program came to a sudden and shattering end. It was a bit ironic, all in all, having just become a cadet at the Garrison, to see the shining light he had been following his whole life snuffed out in an instant. So close. He was old enough to know what this meant from an economic standpoint. It meant nothing good. It meant they would cut funding, their numbers and resources. NASA would be lucky to get a new program off the ground in the next decade. So close. The closer he got to his goal, the more it felt like it was being torn away from him. Yet so far. Kerberos, the Garrison, cargo pilot. It felt like the whole universe was holding him down now, and he wasn't sure he'd ever be strong enough to break free.
"Keith, you need to get over here. Now."
Hunk was speaking into his communicator urgently.
"No, yes, I know we should tell Allura and Shiro, but listen, they're going to freak out if they find out we're planning on breaking into the museum."
Lance grabbed the communicator from Hunk and brought it close to his mouth.
"Keith, find a way to get out here,"
he hissed.
"We're gonna look for the perps."
He could almost hear Keith's retort, probably making fun of his use of perp.
"What are you, a cop?"
But by the time Keith could have said anything, Lance had already taken off down the maintenance hall. It was odd how territorial he was feeling. He would have been mad anyway, that they had been tricked so easily into thinking the heist was going off at the gala instead of the museum, where the highest number of valuable items were being kept. But he was angrier for the sole reason it was revelation they had taken. Lance didn't shy away from how much he missed home. He had stopped trying a while ago. Lance was aloof and funny, sure, but he wasn't disingenuous, and he wasn't one to hide his feelings. He missed home a lot, more and more the longer they were away. And while he knew what they were doing was important, and he felt good about it, he missed home. He missed the beaches and the rain and his house. He missed his parents, his grandmother, and his siblings. Revelation was important. It might have information about Pidge's dad, maybe, but that wasn't the only reason Lance felt panic at the fact it was gone. It was a piece of earth, a flimsy, tenuous connection, but a connection all the same. It was theirs. It was a piece of home, and Lance wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers like this. He ran until he reached a set of doors, and was about to throw open a random one when he felt Pidge grab his arm. "Stop, Lance," she said. "We have to be smart." Hunk was not far behind.
"Yeah,"
he said, coming up behind them.
"Revelation is big, and all the exhibits were big. They can't have gotten far with them."
"All right," Lance said. "Where could they have taken it?" Lance mentally drew up the image of Revelation. The main body of it was about 3 meters across, but the dish was about 6. There was no way someone could drag something that heavy out of the building without some kind of vehicle. But there was a vehicle ban in the area as a safety precaution during the gala. There were about 15 buildings in the museum complex, but it was likely the probe was nearby due to its size. If they wanted a vehicle, it would have had to come from very close by, which meant
"They'll be using a vehicle from the museum."
Hunk gasped.
"The hangar! There's a hangar with operational ships and stuff. Corinne was talking about it earlier."
"All right, so we go there." The 3 of them took off. It took them a while to find the hangar, a combination of darkness, panic, and just plain unfamiliarity meant they were in circles more than once. After 10 minutes that felt more like 100, the trio came to a small, hatch-like door. It was slightly ajar, and Lance thought he could hear voices through on the other side. Hunk stopped them.
"Before we rush in like idiots, what do we do? How do we explain the fact that we're here if we get in trouble?"
Hunk nervously rattled off questions.
"What will Allura say?"
"These are the guys we came here to catch in the first place," Lance said. "If Allura asks, we were just doing our job." Lance rushed in. He ducked down behind a nearby crate, Pidge and Hunk close behind, and observed the hangar. It was full of boxes, crates, and old ships. It was very large, with a domed glass ceiling and wide doors on either side. The edges of the room were cluttered, but the middle appeared to have been cleared out. The only thing in the center of the room was a small dropship with a large cargo door. About 6 thugs were loading the stolen exhibits into the ship. They were tough-looking dudes, about 7 feet tall with 2 pairs of massive, burly arms. Lance did not want to tussle with them. "Is that all of them?" Pidge whispered. As soon as she said it, a tall woman emerged from the ship and walked over to one of the thugs. She was tall, dressed in a sleek flight suit. Her head was bald, and her skin was a pale blue. Lance recognized her with a jolt.
"It's the woman!"
Hunk hissed, recognizing her too.
"The one from the museum, with the kid."
"Plot twist," Pidge whispered. "She must have been there scouting out exhibits or something." The woman strode over to the nearest thug. He nodded to her as she approached. "Is the transporter ready?" she said. "The security systems won't stay down forever."
"Almost," said the thug. "We've a few more adjustments to make. It'll be a few more minutes."
"Fine. Make sure all of the goods are in the radius before you finish. We can't leave anything behind." The thug nodded and shouted for a few of his goons to start working on something. Lance suddenly noticed what it was. A giant ring of green panels arranged around the hangar. In the middle of them was the ship the woman had come out of. The ship's side door was open, revealing several pieces of machinery already stored inside. Revelation among them. "What are those green things?" Lance asked, though his eyes were trained on the probe.
"Some kind of teleportation array? Hunk guessed. They must be teleporting the ship off the museum grounds. It's actually really smart. It means no one can track them on security footage, so if they do that, we'll never find them, Lance said. All right, so we stop them before they do, Pidge whispered. We need to get into that ship. That's where they're holding the probe. All right, Lance said. I'll sneak around and go get inside. Pidge, she said the systems were down, so you stay here and try to reactivate the alarms. If we can trick them, there'll be nowhere for them to hide. Hunk? Yeah? Hunk looked nervous. You distract them. What? Hunk struggled to keep his voice down. Sorry, someone's got to do it. Lance gave his friend a quick pat on the shoulder for reassurance. Before Hunk could protest further, Lance and Pidge were already running. Lance ducked behind a rocket-looking craft, sticking low to the ground as he made his way towards the back of the room. Hey! He heard Hunk say, probably emerging from behind the crate. Lance heard the clicking of guns being cocked, but he didn't stop to look as he skirted the outside of the room, staying close to cover. Who are you? It was one of the thugs. Identify yourself. Hi. I'm just lost. I know you. You're the kid from this afternoon. It was the woman this time. She sounded confused. Lance ran past a few crates, ducking his head low. He reached the back of the room quickly, Hunk's nervous conversation fading into the back of his mind as he caught sight of the ship. The side door was wide open. Lance silently moved into the ship, passing Revelation and half a dozen other probe-looking things. He made his way to the front of the craft, quietly climbing into the pilot seat and peering down into the scene below. Where are your friends? The woman was asking. Oh, I was actually just looking for them. God, Hunk was so bad at this. The woman angled her gun at him. I don't care if you're here to steal our prize, turn us in, or you're just really stupid, she said. Nothing is going to stop us from getting rich off this junk. Out of nowhere, the alarms went off. The thieves stalled for a moment, and this was enough time for Pidge, from her vantage point in the shadows, to shoot her bayard out into the center of the room. The green whip knocked the gun out of the woman's hands. Hunk ran for it, with Pidge in hot pursuit, followed by the angry cries of the thieves. The two of them sprinted for the ship, and Lance readied the flight controls. The ship wasn't too different from the ones he trained in on Earth, albeit in an alien language, so he figured he wouldn't have too much trouble flying it. Hunk and Pidge clambered in, and Lance threw the throttle forward, but as the ship rose, he felt it strain underneath him. It rumbled and slowed. Lance looked out the window, and his heart sank. The thugs were holding on to the ends of grappling lines, shot into the side of the ship. The worst part? They were managing to very easily hold the ship down. Move, Lance, Pidge yelled. I can't! He pushed the throttle until the ship squealed. We're tied down! The ship screamed as Lance fought against the strain of the ropes, but they were lodged in tight. They had to cut them, had to get out, but it was impossible. Why had they gotten themselves into this? Suddenly, the door to the left hangar slammed open, and a single figure came barreling through the opening. The new entrant slid to a stop, directly in front of the ship. Black dress shoes screeching on the polished concrete floor. He was dressed in formal attire, a dinner jacket and tie, which would have looked nice, except that it was severely offset by the fact he was dual-wielding swords. Lance had never been happier to see Keith in his life. Keith! He yelled, hoping he could hear him through the window. Keith turned his head, and the two boys locked eyes. Lance nodded towards the teleportation array, and then back towards the ship's tethers. Some kind of understanding passed between them, and Keith immediately took off towards the ship. Lance couldn't see the action outside, but he could hear it. There were grunts, groans, shouts, and a few screams as Keith dealt the thieves below. With every cry of pain, Lance felt the hold on the ship slacken, and by the time Keith was finished, the ship was buzzing underneath Lance's fingers, ready to go.
Keith ran up to the side door, Hunk grabbing his arm and hauling him into the ship. Keith ran up to the pilot's chair.
Okay,
Lance said as he arrived.
We've changed our minds about calling Shiro and Allura. We should definitely call them.
Keith rolled his eyes.
All right. Can we get out of this shit first? Way ahead of you, K-Dog.
Lance shot a mock salute to Keith, who looked distraught.
Oh, come on. You two? Guys?
It was Hunk.
We have a problem back here.
The ship banked to the left sharply. Lance spun around and saw the cause of the disturbance. While the tethers holding the ship down had been cut, there was one they had missed, latched to revelation. On the other end were the hands of the thugs below, and they didn't look like they were letting go. Lance stalled the ship, sending it clunking to the ground. He couldn't fly, not without leaving revelation behind.
Lance,
Keith yelled.
Pull up. I have an idea. But the probe, do it.
Lance slammed the throttle forward, and the ship lurched to life. The ropes pulled taut, and he could feel revelation start to slide across the floor. Before anyone could stop him, Keith drove both his swords into one of Revelation's arms, the blades cutting through the metal like they were hot butter. Everyone else in the ship screamed.
What the fuck, Keith?
Lance yelled. The arm sprang forward. The top layer of it seemed to have separated and swung down, slamming onto the thugs below in a wide, devastating arc. They were sent flying across the hangar, letting the ropes holding Revelation and the ship fall slack.
Extendable magnometer,
Keith said, meeting the trio's incredulous stares with a blank one of his own.
How the hell did you know it would do that?
Pidge cried in disbelief.
Space camp?
Keith said, like it was an actual answer. The shocking revelation that Keith went to space camp was going to have to wait, as a more important revelation was now free and the ship was untethered. Lance felt the controls give slightly, and he knew now was his opportunity to escape.
We have to go now, Lance,
Hunk shouted, but Lance was way ahead of him. Over the cacophony of alarms, the ship and its screaming passengers, Lance heard the rumbling hum of the teleportation array charging up. He knew he couldn't be in its radius when it activated, or they were goners. He needed to get out of the hangar. But how? All the exits were blocked. His eyes drifted to the ceiling, through the glass ceiling to the clear night sky, twinkling with stars. Nice. Lance threw the throttle forward, and the ship rocketed upwards. He barely registered the trio of protests behind him as the nose of the craft tilted vertically and plowed through the ceiling of the hangar. Glass shattered around them, scattering down across the windows like rain. He kept going, pushing the throttle forward until they had cleared the highest rooftops of the museum. Lance banked sharply to the left, flying the ship low over the rooftops as he shot out of the teleportation's area of effect. Keith was in the back, speaking into his communicator, probably to Shiro. Hunk was gripping Lance's seat back for dear life, and Pidge had thrown herself across Revelation. Lance was ecstatic. It had been a long time since Lance had flown a ship. A proper ship, rather, not a giant, somewhat telepathic mechanical lion. The lions were both harder and easier to control than a normal ship. They understood what you wanted, but you needed to understand them, too. Normal ships were simpler, but more complicated, too. Everything about it was a skill. No amount of luck or telepathy could help you in the cockpit of the fighter jets and low-orbit crafts Lance had trained in. And while Lance wasn't the best pilot in the Garrison, a title that clearly went to Keith, though he'd never admit it to his face, he was still good. He was still a pilot. Up here, he was reminded of why. He remembered seeing the rockets take off from Cape Canaveral when he was younger. After the first time, he had begged his parents to take him back every time they were in Florida. He had seen maybe a dozen launches in his life, and had marveled at the way they'd shot off into the clouds. Now he was here, flying a spaceship into the starry sky, carrying valuable NASA technology. He had imagined himself doing this exact thing 100 times, but never quite in these circumstances. The thought made him laugh, which probably made him look crazy. When had his life gotten so weird?
I'm glad you're enjoying yourself, Hunk shouted. But can we please land? I am very, very uncomfortable.
All right, buddy. Don't worry.
Lance eased the speed and took his eyes away from the stars, looking down over the city below, trying to find a place to land. After a moment, he locked on to the pavilion where the gala was being held. The entire thing lit up like a Christmas tree. That was a good enough place as any. Lance pulled the ship into a landing, but as he did, he mentally grabbed hold of the pure, uninhibited feeling of freedom he was experiencing. It was that original feeling that had led him to the Garrison, that had led him here. The inability to be held down. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was home.